Mr Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is my pleasure to take a call on the Human Rights Amendment Bill. And I thank the Minister for her contribution, but I do think that it's important to really question that in making these changes to fundamentally the way that the Human Rights Commission works, what has changed that has led us to the point where we are making such significant amendments to the way that the Commission operates and to the way that the Commissioners operate. Mr Chair, I know over the last, well, even 15 years, there have been significant changes in the world of race relations, for instance. I don't often begin a speech with anecdote, but in September 2001, which was 14 years ago now, I was living in Arizona. I was on an exchange program with Arizona State University, and I was a student taking a foreign policy class at Arizona State when September 11th happened, and all of the subsequent debate that followed in the days after. I was on a campus that was quite diverse, and there were significant racial attacks on that campus in the days that followed September 11. And I remember distinctly the day, Mr. Speaker, when I went to one of my classes and the lecturer at that class, which was a communications class, instigated a discussion with the students where he asked us to talk about our views on what had happened and our response to it. I remember feeling quite sheepish as a foreign student, even though I was from New Zealand, in taking part in those discussions, because I remember being told on the day of September 11th that I was a foreigner and my view wasn't welcome in the United States at that time. So I didn't say much in that class until one student said quite vocally and without much reaction that he couldn't walk by an Arab student on campus now without wondering about them. I remember that was the point that I think something inside me exploded a little. And I started to question everything I was hearing around me. But the point that I want to make, Mr. Speaker, is that in the past several decades now, the world has changed. Our wars are not along single borders. They're not between single nations pitted for and against. They're not just simply about land and power, they are complex. And with that level of complexity, we run the risk of oversimplifying conflict and distilling them down into dangerously easy categories like race and like religion. And we've seen, I think, that in very recent times, even in New Zealand, in a response to terror attacks instigated by organisations like ISIS. And the consequences that has had on members of, for instance, the Muslim community and how unjustified that is. Now more than ever, Mr. Speaker, we should be entrenching the roles of those who protect our human rights, who guard our human rights, and those who protect against discrimination based on race or based on religion. And so to have before this House at this time a bill which has the ability to dilute the role of those individuals is very sad indeed. I want to come back to the statements that were made by my colleagues in the first reading speeches, where they said wholeheartedly that of course we support the establishment of a Disabilities Commissioner. Absolutely. To support those who are in the community living with a disability who absolutely represent a significant number in the community and deserve to have that representation. But it should not come at the price of losing potentially commissioners for equal opportunities in race relations. Indeed, our minority report stipulates it very concisely. We completely support the establishment in this legislation of a Disabilities Commissioner, as did 22 out of the 42 submitters on this bill. We support the establishment of a Disabilities Commissioner for exactly the same reasons that we support the retention of 2 other designated roles of Equal Employment Opportunities and Race Relations Commissioner. People with disabilities suffer discrimination, and that it's pleasing that there will be a Commissioner with specific responsibility for receiving and addressing complaints on behalf of those New Zealanders. However, of course, as we said, we see no logic in disestablishing two specific commissioners in one breath and establishing another in the next. And as I said in the beginning of my speech, Mr. Speaker, what has changed in our environment, in our society, in our communities that would lead us to the view that we no longer need that specific designation anymore? A little bit, but not nearly enough. Even if we want to pluck out the Equal Employment Opportunities Commissioner, just looking at the facts will tell us that there is still a need for that role within the Human Rights Commission. Putting aside issues of gender representation in Parliament, because we have the luxury of debating that reasonably often, what about simply gender diversity in governance? Someone by the name of Diane McAteer has done a piece of work on this, studying 10 years, I believe, of women's roles in governance. It's been published on the Ministry of Women's Affairs website. She points out that this argument that there's just no room in the top of these positions because there's not enough turnover, she points out that where there has been 10% turnover of directorships, women have only replaced men in those roles 7% of the time. That of the 73 new board roles that have been created, so not directorship but board roles, only 23% have been filled by females. And then putting aside just simply the roles of those who are at the top of the governance tree, there's simply the fact that we still have a 10% gender wage gap in New Zealand. And we seem to be depleting more and more the individual specific roles of even policymakers within the Ministry of Women's Affairs to look at that issue. That was just established by this government. And now we have this happening to the EEO Commissioner. So what has changed that has made the government feel so comfortable that we can disestablish that formal role in legislation? What really has changed? Because the evidence suggests quite simply that not enough has been achieved. The Minister, however, went on to argue in her address that essentially the way that the legislation has set out these new roles, that they can still be effective, that their role hasn't been diluted. But there have been other areas where we've seen this kind of consolidation, and it has really undermined the work that's been done. When the Alcohol Advisory Council was merged into the Health Promotion Authority is an example of that. Because what the bill actually does is give just too much discretion now to the Human Rights Commission to prioritise what work is done. Now, if the Human Rights Commission had the kind of independence that you would hope an entity like that would have from government, maybe that might be something that could provide comfort to members on this side of the House. But the fact that Clause 6 inserts subsection 1b, which states the Commissioner must lead the work of the Commission in any other priority area that is designated by the Chief Commissioner, and the Chief Commissioner may designate an area of work as a priority area only in accordance with the strategic direction and general nature of activities determined by the Commissioner under Section 1a after consultation with the Minister. After consultation with the Minister. Now, our concern with that is that, of course, the Human Rights Commission has the role of, for instance, ensuring that we abide by UN Convention. And there are cases where consecutive governments from time to time have needed to be held to account on that. Now, the more you tie your commission into consultation with the minister and agreement around priorities, the more you lessen that advocacy role. Indeed, that is why Labor has supported the Children's Commissioner in particularly having their role strengthened. And we only heard today that the Children's Commissioners come before Select Committee and said that there are several things that they're going to have to water down their work on, because actually they're having to move resource from advocacy, one of their roles, to monitoring, because they have the role of monitoring child, youth and family residences. It's one of their jobs, and they don't have the resource to do that job properly. So they're having to move resource from one area to another. So it is so critically important that we give that level of independence. And Mr. Speaker, just to conclude, I don't believe that we've made enough progress that we can say that New Zealand now no longer needs these designated roles. And I would probably wager that the two national appointees in both of those roles would probably say the same thing. If any member on that side of the House would like to argue that we've reached the peak of equal employment opportunities and racial harmony, I would welcome that contribution.
Jackie Dean.